Hidden away in a desk drawer lies a small fragment of human bone, worn thin by time. It is part of a forearm, light and ridged, its surface dulled and cracked by age. The ends crumble easily, and the hollow where marrow once flowed is now packed with gritty sand and peat. This remnant came from a burial mound on Snape Common near Aldeburgh in Suffolk, a low rise in the landscape that once concealed one of the earliest ship burials ever discovered in England. Unearthed in 1862, it belongs to a burial tradition dating back to the earliest Anglo-Saxon period, probably no more than 50 years after the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes first settled in Britain, around the year 500. The bone once belonged to a man of rank, perhaps a chieftain or prince, important enough to be laid to rest, not simply in the ground, but within a boat. This vessel was meant to carry him symbolically across the unseen waters that separated the living from the dead, echoing ancient beliefs about the soul's journey beyond the horizon. His name is lost, his deeds forgotten. Yet his burial speaks of a world where memory, myth, and ritual were deeply intertwined. Such questions of identity and remembrance were already being asked 1,000 years ago. Anglo-Saxon poets wondered where the bones of legendary figures lay, questioning whether any trace of them still remained beneath the earth. Among these figures was Wayland the Smith, a name that once carried enormous weight in the imagination of early Northern Europe. Though later generations would struggle to answer these questions, even those early poets already sensed that some figures belonged more to myth than to history. Wayland was not remembered as an ordinary man of flesh and blood. He belonged to an older world of legend, one the Christian Church later tried hard to erase. Yet his story endured. Long after his name vanished from official writings, it remained alive in memory, song, and folklore. People remembered his lineage, his kin, and even specific feats attributed to him. His son was known, as was his father, and stories were told of him crossing deep waters, with a child on his shoulder. These details survived because they were passed down orally, generation after generation, long before they were ever written down. Despite centuries of religious change, foreign conquest, and cultural blending, Wayland's story refused to disappear. Even in the time of Chaucer, echoes of these ancient tales remained familiar enough to be referenced casually, without explanation. His name functioned much like a shared code. To hear it was to recall a whole cycle of stories, instantly, without needing them to be retold. Wayland was as familiar to the Anglo-Saxons as legendary outlaws are to modern audiences. Yet references to him in surviving texts are brief and understated, partly because his pagan roots made writers cautious. Still, he appears in some of the oldest English poetry. One epic remembers him as the creator of an extraordinary coat of mail. Another praises a sword beyond comparison. A shorter, more emotional poem hints at darker aspects of his story, alluding to suffering, exile, and revenge without fully explaining them, trusting that the audience already knew what lay beneath the surface. In that poem, Wayland is described as enduring imprisonment and mutilation, confined by a king who feared his skill and power. He was bound, crippled, and forced into isolation, surrounded only by cold and sorrow. Other verses recall a woman connected to his fate, burdened by fear and foreknowledge, unable to take comfort even in hope. The poem offers no explanation, because none was needed. The audience already carried the story in their minds. Much of what is now known about Wayland would have vanished entirely if not for chance survival. The clearest visual record appears on a small carved box made of walrus ivory in 7th century Northumbria, now known as the Frank's casket. Its survival was nearly accidental. Over the centuries it passed through careless hands, was broken apart, sold, misidentified, and even used as a sewing box in a French farmhouse. Parts were lost, others scattered, until patient collectors slowly reassembled it. The casket is remarkable because it places pagan legend beside biblical and classical scenes, suggesting a world where different traditions still coexisted. On its front panel, Wayland appears without explanation, shown working at his anvil. His body is marked by deformity, a visual reminder of his punishment. At his feet lies a headless corpse, and in his hand he grips a severed head with tongs. Nearby stands a woman, reaching toward him, while birds hover above, symbols tied to transformation and escape. The scene compresses multiple moments of his story into a single image, assuming the viewer already understands what is being shown. Other panels depict entirely different narratives: Roman history, biblical events, and heroic legends from the north. Together, they reveal a craftsman deeply learned, comfortable drawing from many worlds at once. This was not a simple religious object, but a statement about memory, culture, and storytelling in a time of transition. Without this artifact, without a few fragile manuscripts rescued from fire, neglect, or recycling, Wayland's story would be little more than a name. The connections between English and Scandinavian versions of the myth might never have been recognised. It is only because later Norse poems preserved the full narrative that the earlier English hints can now be understood. In the northern version, Wayland appears under a different name, but the core elements remain. He is a master smith, wronged by a king, bound and betrayed. His story begins with three brothers encountering swan maidens by a lake, women who spin precious thread and carry both beauty and destiny. Love binds them together for a time, but fate pulls the women away, leaving the men scattered and searching. Wayland alone remains, waiting, forging rings and weapons in isolation. His skill draws the attention of a king, who captures him while he is away hunting. When Wayland returns, counting his treasures by firelight, he believes his lost love has come back. Instead, he falls into a trap. Bound and helpless, he is brought before the king, accused, robbed of his finest creations and maimed, to prevent escape. The king keeps Wayland alive only to exploit his skill, confining him to an island workshop. There, under watch and in pain, the smith begins to plan. What follows is not told directly here, but the shape of the legend is clear: betrayal answered with cunning, suffering transformed into revenge, and imprisonment ending not in submission, but in flight. Wayland's story survives because fragments endured. A bone in a burial mound, a carved panel on an ivory box, a damaged poem rescued from a bookbinding. Alone, each tells almost nothing. Together, they allow the past to speak again, reminding us how much has already been lost, and how much still lies hidden beneath the surface of history. Volund was crippled and left behind on a small island set close to the mainland coast, a place chosen precisely because escape seemed impossible. There, in enforced solitude, he was made to do the one thing his captors still wanted from him: work. Day after day the forge burned, and the sound of iron being shaped carried over the water. No visitor came to that island unless the king permitted it. The smith's world narrowed to firelight, metal, and memory. He thought constantly of what had been taken, the perfectly balanced sword now hanging at Nidud's side, and the golden ring, once given in love, now shining on Bodvild's hand. Sleep became rare. The hammer rose and fell, but the mind behind it never stopped measuring time, waiting for a weakness, building revenge as carefully as any blade. Eventually, that weakness arrived in the form of curiosity. Nidud's two young sons slipped away and made their secret journey to the island and the smithy. They demanded to see Volund's treasures, the hidden work that only his hands could produce. Jewels, ornaments, rare crafted pieces that seemed almost magical to those who did not understand skill. They wanted keys, chests opened, proof that the legendary craftsman truly possessed wonders beyond ordinary men. Volund met them with calm and then with an offer designed to sound generous. "Return tomorrow," he said, "alone, and speak to no one of this visit." If they kept the secret, they would be given more than a glimpse. They would be given everything. They came back exactly as he wanted. The island that had been his prison became their trap. What happened next was brutal, precise and final. The boys never returned to their father. Their bodies were hidden where the sea air and the smithy smoke would not reveal them. Then Volund began to transform what he had done into objects that could pass unnoticed into the royal household. From their skulls he made drinking vessels, crafted so finely that they could be presented as gifts rather than relics. From their eyes he shaped bright stones and sent them to their mother, tokens of mourning disguised as treasure. From their teeth he carved ornaments for Bodvild, delicate pieces meant to rest against the body like ordinary jewellery. The revenge was not only violence, it was display. It was humiliation disguised as craftsmanship, turned into courtly objects that no one would suspect. Bodvild, drawn by the same fascination that had ruined her brothers, began to seek the smith out. The ring she wore mattered to her, not only as a royal gift, but as a beautiful thing, linked to an older story she did not fully understand. When it broke, she needed an excuse to approach him without admitting the truth. She went in secret, bringing the damaged ring as her reason, insisting that no one could know. Volund listened, offered reassurance, and promised a repair that would hide the break so perfectly that her parents would never discover it. Then he poured her drink. The warmth and bitterness made her heavy-eyed, and as her senses dulled, the smith took what he wanted from her. The act was not described as romance. It was a final stroke in a design that had been forming in his mind since the night he was bound. When the time came, Volund declared that his wrongs had been answered. Then he rose into the air on wings he had engineered in captivity, lifting himself beyond the reach of boats, guards, and chains. Nidud could do nothing but watch and grieve, struck helpless by the loss of his sons and the violation of his daughter. A king made powerless by the one man he had tried to reduce to a tool. For the early English world, the meaning of this tale was not a puzzle that needed moral explanation. Volund was remembered above all as the supreme craftsman, the figure whose skill set the highest standard. Men living in centuries later, labelled as bleak or primitive, did not treat him as a childish superstition. They treated him as an ideal. They admired workmanship, they pursued it, and they left behind proof in metalwork so refined that it still silences easy assumptions about those centuries. The treasures raised from Sutton Hoo make that clear. Artistry of the highest order, made by hands that understood balance, pattern, and power. In that light, it is enough to notice that Volund resembles other legendary makers in older traditions. The limping Greek god of the forge and the master builder who escaped through the sky on wings of his own invention. Different names, different cultures, but the same human fascination with skill, so great it feels dangerous. The more striking lesson, though, is not simply the story itself, but the way it survived at all. The evidence for Volund's existence in writing and art came close to being erased. Key sources narrowly escaped destruction, and one surviving reference is so brief it would be useless on its own. Without outside parallels, it would be almost impossible to reconstruct the fuller tale. Yet the Old English hints and the Old Norse version agree in remarkable ways, even though centuries separate the moment. Each culture wrote the story down. That kind of agreement suggests something steady beneath the surface, an older shared tradition that endured long enough to be recorded in different places and different times. And Volund is not alone. If one legendary figure survives only by luck and fragments, then others must have been lost the same way. The landscape of early English tradition is scattered with partial remains, names without stories, allusions without context, images without explanations. Some pieces are gone forever. Any attempt to rebuild the older mythic world is like assembling a skeleton from scattered bones, and then trying to imagine the living body from what is missing. The result, even when successful, will never be perfect. It will limp like Volland himself, because parts of the original will always be beyond recovery. From that point, the view widens beyond one myth and one smith. At first glance, the modern English people can seem like a patchwork formed by successive waves. The older Britons already living on the islands, then newcomers from across the sea after the collapse of Roman authority, then later arrivals from Scandinavia, and later still the Normans after 1066. Each change left marks. Each arrival altered language, law, and custom. Yet it is easy to exaggerate how alien these crossings truly were. The ancient Britons were not strangers from a different world. They were related, in the broad family of northwestern Europe, to the Germanic settlers who followed. The later Scandinavian groups were close cousins to those Germanic peoples, not distant invaders from another continent. Even the Normans, for all their political impact, carried their own mixture of northern and continental roots. A truly violent genetic and cultural shock would look very different. Imagine an invasion not from nearby shores, but from a far-off world with entirely different traditions and languages. Imagine an England where the skyline held buildings, shaped by an unfamiliar architectural logic, where the public symbols and sacred art belonged to a cultural system that had never before touched the island. Physical appearance would shift dramatically over generations, and so would the imagination itself. The mind quickly grasps how deep the change would run when the symbols become easy to picture in places where they have never stood. Compared with that, the interweaving that formed the English was real but not extreme. The sense of being a mongrel people is, in many ways, more apparent than it is biologically radical. The deeper story of origins, then, can be approached in stages. Long before written history, they were the earliest ancestors of the island population, people living thousands of years ago in conditions that can only be reconstructed from archaeology. Later come the communities visible around the birth of Christ in northwestern Europe, groups whose material culture and languages show long development. Finally comes the period after about 450, when allied tribes crossed from the continent and began to form what would become the English nation. That last phase is the most dramatic in chronicles, but it rests on older foundations, and those foundations connect England to a far wider web. Because behind Britons, Germans, Romans, and Celts lies a much older relationship, one traced not through blood alone, but through language. Across much of Europe and parts of India, a broad family of languages developed from a single parent tongue. That ancestral language is called Indo-European. It cannot be heard directly. No one has ever found an original Indo-European skeleton with a label attached to its ribs, and no one ever will. Yet the existence of that shared parent tongue is not a fantasy. It is demonstrated in the way words and sounds correspond across distant languages, even after thousands of years of change. The time when this common language was still a single unity can only be estimated. Some scholars argue that it must be placed far back in prehistory, perhaps around 4000 BC. The homeland remains debated. Some argue for Europe, others for Asia, and the argument has never truly ended. What can be suggested with more confidence comes from shared vocabulary. The parent language carries clues about the world its speakers knew. It belonged to a late Stone Age level of life. tools, and weapons of stone appear in the shared word roots. Words related to the anvil and hammer appear across languages in forms that clearly echo one another, showing that metalworking concepts existed early enough to shape shared speech, even if the technology evolved later. Even the word for a dagger in Old English traces back to a root also found in Latin, tied to the idea of stone and cutting. The shared vocabulary also hints at daily life. These people hunted and herded. They followed wild animals and searched for pasture, yet they also knew settled seasons of farming. Their language preserves verbs for ploughing, sowing, harvesting, grinding grain, and baking bread. It names familiar animals: cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, geese, ducks. At the same time, it lacks names for creatures that would have been obvious if the speakers had lived in regions where such animals were common. That absence helps map the environment indirectly. Milk appears as an understood substance, suggesting dairying was part of life. Family structure also leaves traces. Words for close kin are deeply shared: father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, grandchild. Some terms appear and others do not, hinting at patterns of marriage and household organisation. The presence of terms that fit a system where a wife joins the husband's family, and the absence of certain other terms suggests a communal household pattern with older generations at the centre. Such arrangements still exist in some societies today, preserving a social logic far older than the states and borders that later formed. Nothing survives in written form from the parent language itself. Yet, its rough shape can be reconstructed because language change is not random. Sound shifts follow patterns. A major early split divided the Indo-European family into two broad pronunciation groups. In one branch, an older type of key sound shifted into a S-like sound. In the other, it remained a hard K. This difference became a diagnostic marker, showing how languages drifted apart. Later, among the ancestors of Germanic languages, another shift turned certain K sounds into H sounds in specific conditions. That is why related words can appear with striking differences that still point back to a single root. It is not mysterious. It is the result of regular transformation over time. These divisions do not map neatly onto simple East and West geography, as once assumed. Discoveries and linguistic evidence show that hard K languages existed far to the east, and the supposed boundaries blur under closer inspection. Yet the divisions still help estimate when the original unity broke apart. By around 1500 BC, Indo-European peoples had clearly dispersed widely. Some moved toward the edges of Europe, some into Asia Minor, some into India, and some pushed astonishingly far east. Certain groups appear suddenly in the historical record as rulers over populations who spoke entirely different languages, revealing complex migrations and conquests hidden behind the tidy labels of later textbooks. For this purpose, it is not necessary to track every tribe to its destination. What matters is the cultural affinity that connects many peoples who later seem separate. Hindus, Greeks, Romans, Celts, and the northern groups that produced the ancestors of English speakers. Alongside them, there were always other communities whose languages did not belong to the Indo-European family, peoples like the Basques, and later, the Finns and Hungarians. Even so, those languages are not irrelevant. Words are borrowed across boundaries, and sometimes a borrowed word acts like a small lamp, revealing something about belief. One such borrowed word in Finnish points upward, toward the sky, suggesting that even across language, families, the shared human habit of reading meaning into the heavens could travel with a single term, carried from one tongue into another and kept alive long after its original speakers were gone. To make sense of early northern myths, it helps to look beyond any single nation and follow the shared roots linking the peoples of Northern Europe. The ancestors of today's Germans, Frisians, Dutch, Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, Icelanders, and English belong to the same broad branch of the Indo-European world. Older labels like Germanic or Teutonic have often been used for them, but those words have become blurred in meaning and burdened with modern associations. A cleaner way to describe them is to name them for the region where they first become visible in historical memory: the Northwest Europeans. The larger Indo-European question, whether the earliest speakers began in Europe or Asia, remains debated. Yet that debate matters less here, because by the time this northern group emerges clearly, it is already settled in Europe. Their own traditions consistently point toward a homeland in the far north, around the southern end of Scandinavia. Early English literature carries faint echoes of that northern origin, preserving it not as geography on a map, but as legend and ancestral memory. One famous example appears in the early epic tradition, through the figure later associated with the Danish royal line, a founder ancestor whose name is remembered as Scyld, meaning shield. Behind that royal title, another name seems to be hiding in plain sight, a name tied not to a weapon but to a bundle of grain. Later records, shaped by Christian storytelling habits, tried to attach this figure to biblical genealogy, as if fitting an older legend into a new sacred framework. Yet the older core of the story remains recognizable. A child arrives from the sea, drifting towards shore in an open boat. Different medieval writers retell the same image in their own way. In one version, the child reaches an island called Skarni, unknown and helpless, yet surrounded by weapons as if fate has already marked him for kingship. The local people take him in, raise him as one of their own, and eventually choose him as their ruler. In another version, the boy is carried in a boat without oars to a northern island described as Skansa. He is found asleep, his head resting on a sheaf of grain, and that detail becomes his identity. The people treat him as something extraordinary, bring him up carefully, and later remember him as a ruler linked to a place called Slaswick, later known as Hythabu. From that region, the story continues, the narrative pointing toward the later movement of Angles into Britain. This northern focus is not only preserved in legend. A historian writing in the 6th century, Jordanes, described Scandinavia as a place that continually sent peoples outward. He portrayed it as a source that produced migrations again and again, as if the north kept releasing new tribes into the wider world. His language is vivid and deliberate, presenting Scandinavia as a place that generates nations, a reservoir of population that spills southward over time. The very name he used for Scandinavia reappears in the names of new settlements, founded by migrating groups, as if communities carried the memory of home with them and planted it abroad. That habit is familiar in later centuries, when people crossing oceans reuse old names in new lands, turning nostalgia into geography. Place names and river names also support the idea of a northern starting point. Some of the oldest Scandinavian tribal names appear deeply rooted in the local landscape and seem to belong to an early age, even to Bronze Age conditions. Names formed from fjords, from fair districts, from shoreline features shaped by tide and ebb, suggest communities identifying themselves by the terrain they lived among. These are not names borrowed from elsewhere. They read like names that grew out of a region and stayed attached to it. History, too, fits the pattern. From around the 1st century before Christ onward, the general movement of these northern peoples trends south, spreading through northern Europe and beyond. later centuries repeat the same outward motion in different forms, reaching into France and Spain, along the coasts of North Africa, into southern Italy, across Eastern Europe toward Russia and the shores of the Black Sea, and of course westward to the islands of Britain. Over a long span, the direction is consistent, north to south, outward from Scandinavia into the wider world, sometimes as settlement, sometimes as raiding, sometimes as conquest. When these settlers reached Britain, the land they encountered was not an empty stage. Much of it was forested, with vast wooded tracts stretching for miles. Marshlands spread across wide areas, making travel and settlement difficult in places. The landscape carried the imprint of Rome, too. Straight, stone-laid roads running across the island, linking cities and forts with an almost mechanical logic. Yet, by the late Roman period, many of those towns had already begun to weaken. After the new settlers arrived, some stone-built cities fell silent altogether, left to wind and rain, with animals nesting where people once lived. A number were never properly resettled. Others remained half-ruined for generations. Even where life continued, the old Roman town world often felt strange to newcomers, whose instincts leaned toward fields, timber buildings, and dispersed rural life. To many early English settlers, the remnants of Roman Britain seemed disconnected from ordinary human existence. Massive walls, paved roads, abandoned fortifications, and crumbling bathhouses looked like structures made for a different kind of being. Later poetry describing such ruins carries that sense of awe and distance. The broken stonework becomes a symbol of vanished power. Towers falling, walls cracking, the works of an earlier age collapsing into dust, while the imagination fills the empty spaces with visions of wealth, armour, gold, feasting, and a proud court that once stood where silence now reigns. The newcomers did not arrive in a single neat campaign. The process stretched across centuries, with raiding and probing long before the settlement date, often given as the turning point. By the early 5th century, groups were already pushing inland, sometimes far up the country. The lines between invader and local were not always clean. Some early leaders carry names that do not fit a simple story of outsiders alone, hinting that intermarriage and alliance had already begun before the major migrations hardened into permanent settlement. In a world where communities were mixing at the edges, names could travel across languages through marriages and kinship ties. And children could be named in ways that honoured both sides. Roman authorities understood the danger before the final break came. Defensive systems were reorganised, and commands were set up to protect the island's vulnerable points. One command guarded the north from York, supported by legions and auxiliary troops. Another command protected the southeastern coast, the region most exposed to sea raiders, with a chain of strong forts along what later became known as the Saxon shore. These coastal fortresses were large, heavily built, ringed by ditches and towers, with walls rising high in places and garrisons stationed inside. On paper, they formed a barrier from Norfolk down to Hampshire. In reality, once the pressure became constant, they functioned less like a solid dam and more like scattered stones set against a rising tide. Their ruined remains still mark the coastline today, evidence of how serious the threat had become. Exactly why Britain collapsed into vulnerability around the early 5th century remains complex. Internal political struggle, breakdown of central command, rival generals, local power grabs, and repeated plunder all played a part. In that instability, raiding could transform into occupation. What began as hit-and-run violence could become long-term settlement when resistance weakened and opportunities widened. The incoming groups came from different regions. Saxons from areas along the North Sea coast and river mouths, Angles from the district later known as Angel, and Jutes from territories tied to the lower Rhine zone, in some traditions. Those labels, though, describe only the broadest outline. The migrating forces were likely mixed, full of smaller tribal elements travelling together. After a few generations in Britain, the names blurred further. Angles could be called Saxons. Saxons could call themselves Angles, and eventually the shared identity that took hold was English, with their speech described as English as well. Modern historians often emphasize that this takeover did not unfold like a planned military operation with clear lines, fortified bridgeheads, and measured advances. It was more like a gradual pushing in, settlements spreading where land was open, where towns were failing, where villas had already declined, and where the old system had lost its labour and structure. Some scholars have argued that the new arrivals mixed quickly and deeply with the local population, forming hybrid communities within a generation or two. And that material culture changed as a result. Others resist that view, pointing to the limited influence of the native language on Old English, and to the way certain terms suggest dominance and subordination rather than blending on equal terms. The truth may not sit comfortably at either extreme. What can be said safely is that the reality varied by region and decade, shifting with local conditions and power balances. What remains clear is that early English identity did not cut itself off from the continent. For generations, attention and memory stayed oriented toward Northern Europe. The earliest heroic stories set their action overseas, among figures whose homes and battles belonged to Denmark, Sweden, and lands farther east. That continuing sense of origin endured so strongly that, even before Christianity fully settled across England, missionaries were being sent back across the sea to convert relatives. The language used in such correspondence reveals how these bonds were imagined. Kinship framed as shared blood and shared bone, a single people divided by water but still connected by ancestry. That persistence of memory matters. It shows how resilient ideas can be and how strongly communities cling to inherited stories when they are forced into new environments. Migration rarely happens because life is comfortable. It happens because something pushes people out. Whatever pressures drove those settlers from the continent, the crossing itself was harsh and uncertain. They came in open boats, overloaded with the tools of survival and the small objects that made a household feel whole. Pots, bowls, buckets bound with metal, and the essential heavy equipment of farming. Livestock had to come too, because these were not armies living off supply trains. They were moving communities. Pigs and sheep were carried and tethered. Poultry was kept close. Anything that could be preserved was brought along because the new land offered no guarantee. On arrival, settlement often began in small clusters. The earliest homes were simple, sometimes partially sunken into the ground, practical against wind and cold. Excavations have uncovered the remains of daily life on those floors. Broken pottery, ash, animal bones, and occasionally the body of a dog left where it fell. These were not grand halls, these were the structures of ordinary people. Yet the elite lived differently, and the poems described their timber halls with pride, great buildings of feasting and ceremony. Archaeology has begun to confirm that such halls were real. A major site excavated in the 20th century revealed an early aristocratic complex with multiple, enormous halls, some nearly 100 feet long, and another building that appears to have served religious purposes. Clothing was made at home from coarse woven cloth, though finer textiles existed for those who could afford them. Footwear was practical rather than heavy, suited to earth tracks rather than stone pavements. Adult men commonly carried weapons as a normal part of life. The long spear, the knife worn at the belt, and for a smaller number, the long iron sword. Shields were widespread, wooden circles reinforced, with iron at the centre to protect the hand. Women often wore brooches, sometimes paired or even tripled, with strands of glass and amber beads hung between them. From belts hung everyday tools and personal items, small rings, knives, fire-making gear, and distinctive fittings that appear again and again in graves. Alongside all these physical belongings came something less visible, but just as enduring: the furniture of the mind. The settlers brought their stories, their assumptions about the world, their sense of fate, and the gods their ancestors had named. Much of that older belief system was later reshaped or driven out by Christianity, and the written record that survives is thin. Because of that scarcity, some scholars have questioned whether the early English were ever deeply pagan at all, suggesting that their old religion weakened during the sea crossing and survived only as shallow habit. The difficulty is that the surviving evidence was filtered by the very institution most committed to erasing what came before. The timeline is fast: settlement around the mid-5th century, the arrival of Christian missionaries at the end of the 6th, and the completion of conversion within a few generations. A person living at the time of the major church decisions in the 7th century could easily have known an older relative who had lived and died under the old gods. That speed makes it tempting to imagine a weak paganism. Yet religious conflict rarely behaves gently. Competing faiths do not usually coexist politely. They struggle, they overwrite, they absorb, and they suppress. Christianity had already done that elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, adopting certain customs while stripping them of their old meanings, transforming seasonal festivals and household practices into parts of a Christian calendar. Once Christianity dominated England, it could erase memory while keeping useful habits. Old festivals could survive under new names. Agricultural rites could be reframed as blessings rather than charms. The deeper stories of the gods could be pushed out of writing because writing itself was controlled by churchmen. Monasteries held literacy, manuscripts, and the power to decide what deserved preservation. It would be unrealistic to expect scribes to copy pagan myths as if they were neutral entertainment. If heathen literature survived at all, it often did so by accident, through neglect, through fragmentary quotation, or through the simple fact that complete erasure is never perfectly achieved. Modern people often trust written evidence more than any other kind, as if only ink can make a thing real. That instinct can become misleading here, because the absence of pagan texts in monastic libraries does not prove the absence of pagan belief in early villages. In fact, the old religion left itself written into the land in a different way. Place names preserve gods and sacred ideas. Landscapes carry their memory stubbornly. Even when official records fall silent, the ground keeps speaking through names, customs, and the quiet persistence of folk tradition. In that sense, the older mythology may have been preserved more faithfully by farmers and village storytellers than by any manuscript. And the deeper question is not whether the early English believed, but how much of what they believed was later pushed out of view and hidden in plain sight. Place names left behind by the Anglo-Saxons act like small fossils of belief. They preserve two kinds of clues about the old religion. First, they keep the names of gods and other unseen beings alive long after temples and stories faded. Second, they often point to places that were once treated as holy: a grove, a hilltop, a mound, a clearing where people gathered, offered, swore, or feared to tread. From these names alone, at least 3 gods and 1 goddess can be traced with confidence in Anglo-Saxon England. The gods are Woden, Thunor, and Tu, and the goddess is Frigg. The pattern is uneven, and that unevenness matters. Woden appears most widely, which fits the picture of a chief god whose fame travelled across kingdoms and dynasties. His name is scattered across the English landscape more than any other pagan deity. He is also unusual in another way. He seems to have collected nicknames, a sign that people spoke of him familiarly as well as fearfully. Evidence for Woden's worship can be mapped across a wide sweep of counties, reaching into Kent, Essex, Hampshire, Wiltshire, Somerset, Staffordshire, Bedfordshire, and Derbyshire. One strong concentration appears near the Vale of Pewsey, in the region of the great earthwork known as Wansdyke. Close by are older place names that once carried his name more clearly, names tied to features of the land: a barrow, a valley, a boundary ridge. Another cluster sits farther east, near the headwaters of the River Thames, where names like Wensbury and Wensfield preserve the same echo. Elsewhere, variations survive in names attached to hills and settlements, showing that the cult of Woden was not confined to one tribe or one corner of England. It crossed the lines between Jutish, Saxon, and Anglian territories, which suggests a god who functioned not only as a divine ancestor of kings, but as a figure known to ordinary people as well. Some names related to Woden also shine a light on how people imagined him. A recurring element appears that connects to the figure of Grim, a name tied in northern tradition to a wandering, hooded god moving between worlds in disguise. In southern England, several earthworks are called by that grim name, as if popular memory credited their construction to a supernatural maker. Those ramparts and ditches inspired awe, and awe tends to attach itself to a familiar name. The use of a nickname rather than a formal title suggests something important. This was not purely distant, priestly reverence. This was a god spoken of in village talk, invoked in casual explanation, and attached to the landscape in a way that sounded natural on the tongue. Thunor, the thunder god, sits closer to the daily life of farmers. His name appears frequently in regions like Essex and Wessex, hinting that he may have been the most commonly honoured deity there. His worship also shows up in Jutish territory, remembered in older names for mounds and clearings. Modern place names still carry him in softened form. Thunderfield, Thundridge, and several locations where his name is joined to an old word for a wood or woodland clearing. That detail matters because it lines up with what Roman observers said about northern religion. Worship was often tied to groves, not to buildings of stone. The god's name paired with clearing suggests gatherings beneath trees, sacred spaces made by nature and a little human shaping rather than by walls and roofs. Tew appears less often than Woden or Thuna, but he is far from absent. His memory survives in scattered names across counties, including places whose older forms point to a lost grove or a wetland edge tied to him. One striking example is a village name that means something like Tew's Hill Spur, linked to a prominent point of high ground above a wide vale. The location is commanding, the kind of place that makes an impression even without a shrine standing on it. A suggestion has been made that the vale below may have taken its name from a horse figure cut into the hillside, a symbol that could fit a god associated with power, prestige, and old authority. Even if that specific connection remains uncertain, the broader point stands. TW's name attaches itself to strong sites, and that attachment hints at a cult that mattered. Frigg, the great goddess, is harder to catch, but not impossible. Her name appears to be preserved in Hampshire in a place once recorded in a form that could mean Frigg's people. Nearby names in the same county seem to have held onto her identity like a puzzle piece that later generations no longer understood. One scholar argued that two of these names were originally identical and may have meant the hill of the goddess Frigg. Farther north, another place name may preserve her in association with marshy ground, and her name also surfaces in the east, in a village whose spelling still hints at an older form. The pattern fits what often happens with goddesses in place. Names, fewer examples, more ambiguity, but a stubborn persistence all the same. Beyond gods and goddesses, place names also witness a crowded supernatural world. Some locations preserve the memory of beings that were not exactly divine, yet were feared or respected as part of the unseen population of the land. A wood or hill can carry a name linked to a being imagined as a masked spirit or night walker. Other names preserve words for goblins, malicious visitors, or restless presences. Some place names carry an element meaning giant, attached to a ford or a mere, as if a particular crossing or patch of water had a story of something huge and dangerous behind it. There is a temptation to treat these giants as harmless fairy tale leftovers, as if they were too weak to matter. But older poetry hints at something sharper. The giants were not merely big creatures loitering on the edge of the world. They belonged to a deeper mythic pattern in which they once attacked the gods and paid for it. The details are blurred now, as if a fog settled over the story during centuries of Christian copying and forgetting. But the outline remains: a conflict between gods and giant kind, and a catastrophic flood that overwhelms the aggressors. That kind of story does not belong to mild folklore. It belongs to the same stormy mythic landscape found across the northern world. Other place names recall witches and spell workers, suggesting valleys associated with sorcery or feared knowledge. Mythic animals also appear. A pool can preserve a word for a water monster, a reminder that deep water was not only dangerous in a practical sense, but haunted in imagination too. A mound can preserve a word for a dragon, binding a burial place to the idea of a serpent thing coiled around treasure or death. Even if later generations stopped believing, they still repeated the names, and every repetition kept the old world view faintly alive. Alongside these personal names and creature names, a different set of place name elements speaks even more directly about religious practice. 3 old words show up again and again across England, and their sheer frequency suggests that sacred sites were common. One word refers to a temple or sacred building. Another points to a hill sanctuary, a raised place set apart. The third, and most widespread, refers to an idol, a shrine, or simply a spot recognized as holy. These words survive embedded in the names of villages, hills, and crossings across multiple counties. Even where the visible shrine vanished, the word remained glued to the location, as if the land itself refused to forget. Taken together, these names form a quiet map of belief. They show that pagan religion was not an abstract philosophy held only by elites. It was practical, local, and rooted in specific places. A grove clearing for a thunder god, a ridge associated with an older chief deity, a hill spur tied to an ancient power, a marsh remembered as belonging to a goddess. They also show that the spiritual landscape was not empty except for the gods. It was crowded with beings that could harm, mislead, or simply remind people that the world was larger than what the eye could measure. Old northern societies often allowed religious authority and worldly leadership to overlap. In later Scandinavian tradition, a ruler could also function as a priestly figure, combining sacred and political power in one role. If that model was known in the wider northern world, it becomes easier to imagine how sacred sites were maintained, and why so many place names remember shrines without leaving written descriptions behind. A king or local leader could sponsor a holy place, guard it, or claim descent from a god connected to it. Then, when Christianity arrived and removed the old rituals, the physical site might lose its function, but the name would persist because the name was useful for directions, boundaries, and everyday speech. Across England, old place names do more than label the land. They preserve a record of belief. Some names still carry the memory of gods and spirits. Others point to what used to be sacred ground. A mound, a clearing, a hilltop sanctuary, a shrine that once drew people in for vows, offerings, and seasonal rites. In a few cases, the clues are unusually direct. A 7th century name for a site near Farnham in Surrey appears to have meant the Shrine of Cusa. In Sussex, another name seems to have meant the Shrine of Paxhall. Names like these suggest that a sacred place could be tied not only to a deity, but to a local figure or spirit whose identity is now lost. The same pattern appears when the ownership of a holy site seems to be claimed by a group or kin community. Some early names imply sanctuaries associated with particular families or factions, as if a shrine belonged to a known lineage, the way grazing land or woodland rights could belong to one. That does not mean private worship in the modern sense, but it does hint at a world in which sacred places could be maintained, protected, and perhaps controlled by a network of relatives and dependents. Religion, status, and local power were not neatly separated. A sacred site could be a communal focus, yet also carry the mark of those who guarded it and benefited from it. When the distribution of these names is studied, another point becomes hard to ignore. The evidence is not evenly spread. The strongest concentration of heathen place names runs like a belt from Kent and the southeast, up through the heart of the country into the Midlands. Farther west, the traces thin out, and in the far north they are rarer still. Even where the old religion certainly existed, the landscape does not preserve it with equal density. Yet even with that unevenness, the surviving names are more than enough to show that pagan belief was once deeply rooted. Villages, fields, ridges and hills still speak with the old vocabulary of sanctuaries, idols, holy enclosures, and feared beings. In effect, the land itself answers the question of whether early English communities were seriously heathen. The language of the countryside indicates that they were. The written record is where arguments have often grown louder, because the written record is complicated. Some scholars have distrusted early English poetry, especially when it seems to preserve native tradition. Others have leaned heavily on later Scandinavian material, because it is rich and dramatic and survives in fuller form. Both instincts carry risks. Scandinavian sources can illuminate, but they can also mislead if later ideas are pressed into earlier gaps. At the same time, dismissing early English material as attainted can swing too far in the other direction and hide what is genuinely ancient. A more careful approach is to compare what survives on both sides of the North Sea, and to treat agreement as meaningful. When early English and Northern sources overlap, they often match in striking ways. One famous example is the Wayland story, where English references are scattered but still line up convincingly with the Northern version. That kind of correspondence suggests that the shared inheritance is real, even if later writers shaped and retold it. The same kind of caution matters when a story looks biblical on the surface. One case stands out: the great flood mentioned in heroic poetry. It is tempting to assume that any flood story must be taken from Scripture, especially after so many centuries of Christian culture. Yet flood stories exist in hundreds of traditions worldwide, and the presence of a flood does not automatically prove a biblical source. In early English verse, the drowned beings are not ordinary humans in need of salvation. They are monsters, elves, hostile creatures, and giants, figures that belong to native tradition. The poem describes them as punished by the Lord and connects them to Cain. But that link reads like a Christian overlay placed on older material. The older beings are native. The biblical genealogy is a later framework built around them. The decisive difference is the shape of the story. The biblical flood centers on rescue. A chosen family preserved in an ark, life saved so the world can begin again. In the northern story, the flood is not mainly about saving humanity. It is about the defeat of giants and the remaking of the world. The deluge is tied to cosmic violence and to creation itself. There is no central ark motif, no emphasis on a single righteous household preserved as the seed of all future people. Instead, the flood functions like a cleansing catastrophe, after which the world takes a new form. That pattern fits a creation myth, more than a salvation narrative. This is why the earliest English references to a flood can be read as a Christianized pagan material, rather than a simple retelling of scripture. Christian poets and scribes inherited old names and old story shapes, then reinterpreted them so they could sit alongside Christian teaching. The result is a hybrid, the language of the church surrounding the creatures of an older world. The process was common in early medieval England. It helped converts make sense of a new faith without losing every thread of the old imagination at once. The same mixture appears in the healing and fertility charms that survive in later manuscripts. These texts are notoriously hard to interpret because they blend languages and traditions, sometimes even sliding into phrases that look like nonsense. Yet their survival shows that ritual speech and practical magic continued under a Christian surface. A charm for a sprain, recorded widely across Northern Europe in many versions, has a clear, deep ancestry. In one form, a sacred rider heals an injured animal with the repeated binding of bone to bone, sinew to sinew, blood to blood. In an older continental form, the healing is performed by pagan figures, and the same binding phrases appear with remarkable similarity. Even farther away, parallels exist in ancient Indo-European traditions, suggesting that the core pattern is older than Christianity and older than any single set of named gods. These charms also preserve a religious layer that seems even more ancient than worship of personal deities. Some rites point toward reverence for the sun, the moon, and the earth as powers in themselves. A field fertility ritual includes words directed towards the east and spoken repeatedly with formal gestures, followed by an invocation of the earth as the mother of people. It then prescribes an offering placed beneath the first furrow of the plough, a small loaf prepared with milk and blessed water. Whatever Christian language later copyists added, the underlying logic is agricultural and elemental. The rite treats the land as a living partner in survival. The earth is not simply soil, it is a force that can be greeted, appealed to, and asked to become fruitful. Moon-linked timing appears in other remedies as well, where healing actions are to be carried out during a certain phase of the moon. Such instructions belong to a worldview in which nature is not background scenery, but an active system of signs and power. Later law codes explicitly condemned worship of the sun and moon, as well as fire, water, wells, stones, and trees. Those prohibitions matter because they show what had to be fought. Bans are rarely written against practices that do not exist. Written evidence for temples and idols also survives, and here the record becomes unusually clear. Christian leaders advise missionaries not to destroy pagan temples outright, but to cleanse them, transform them, and reuse them. The logic was practical. If people saw familiar sacred places still standing, they might more easily shift allegiance from old gods to the new faith. That advice assumes temples existed as recognizable structures. Another source preserves a memory of a king who maintained a single building with 2 altars, trying to serve both Christ and the old gods at once. Other letters speak openly about idol images shaped like humans, made of ordinary materials by local craftsmen, yet treated as divine. These are not vague hints. They show that some communities had shrines with images, and that Christian writers saw those images as a direct rival. As Christianity gained ground, rulers issued laws aimed at suppressing heathen practice. Those laws list what was forbidden: worship of idols, the sun and moon, fire and flood, wells and stones, trees and groves, and the use of sorcery. The list reads like a map of the old sacred world. Wells and stones appear beside heavenly bodies. Forest and water sit beside ritual killing. It is a reminder that paganism was not only a set of stories about named gods. It was also a network of sacred places and actions embedded in daily life, where people sought luck, protection, healing, and fertility. Seasonal observance strengthens the same picture. An early account of the Old English calendar describes a year measured by natural cycles and farming needs, but also by offerings and holy seasons. Months were linked to ploughing, to milk yields, to harvest rites, to the first full moon of winter, and to the sacrifice of animals that could not be kept alive through the cold months. Religion and practical husbandry moved together. Offerings and feasts followed the turning of the year. The sacred was woven into the same calendar that governed grass growth, livestock survival, and the timing of work in the fields. From this angle, the spiritual life of early England looks less like a distant mythology and more like an environmental relationship. The sky, the seasons, storms, and the fertility of the land were not abstractions. They were immediate forces that shaped life and death. A violent thunderstorm could feel like an attack from above, as if an unseen power had struck the ground with a hammer. In such moments, it is easy to understand why a thunder god seemed real, why awe became devotion, and why devotion felt necessary rather than optional. Putting all this evidence together, place names, charms, calendar traditions, letters about temples, and laws against pagan worship, one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who settled in England, practiced a serious heathen religion for generations. At least 4 major divine figures are strongly indicated by the landscape itself. Sacred places existed, some with temples and images. Priests operated within local society and, in some cases, may have held authority that blended religious and secular leadership. Ritual followed the year, with sacrifices and communal feasts, with pleas for favour and thanks for survival. Beneath the named gods lay an even older layer: reverence for the earth and the sky as the great providers, approached through rites that bound community and nature together. Long before Christianity became the cultural default in England, the newcomers who settled the island brought their own sacred map of reality with them. They were pagans, and like pagan peoples everywhere, they did not live in a spiritual vacuum. They imagined gods with distinct personalities and family ties. They told stories about how the world began and how human life entered it. And they tried to explain what waited beyond death. Many traditions also carried a darker companion idea. Not only that the world had an origin, but that it would one day reach an end. There are good reasons to think the Anglo-Saxons shared the same full set of questions and offered their own answers, even if those answers survive today only in fragments. Modern descendants of the Anglo-Saxons inherit a largely biblical framework, shaped by centuries of Christian teaching, and that habit can make the older worldview feel remote, or even unthinkable. Christianity, after all, demanded something the early English did not originally practice: strict belief in a single God. The first Anglo-Saxon settlers were polytheists. Their divine world was crowded, structured, and familial, populated by multiple powers rather than one supreme, solitary ruler. It is not hard to see why older habits can linger beneath newer ones. Even within Christian practice, language and imagination sometimes drift toward a kind of heavenly court, especially where saints, holy figures, and sacred roles gather around the central deity. That does not mean Christianity and paganism are the same, but it helps explain why the human mind, trained for generations to think in layered divine hierarchies, does not always become entirely single-focused overnight. The official conversion of the English began when a mission reached Kent at the end of the 6th century. In AD 597, Augustine arrived in Thanet, a little over a century after groups traditionally labelled Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had begun settling in Britain. At that moment, Anglo-Saxon England could be described as a pagan outpost surrounded by Christian neighbours, the Brittonic Christian regions to the west, the Christian kingdoms in Ireland and Scotland, and the Christian Franks across the Channel. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, heard news of the landing and treated it cautiously. Tradition claims he insisted on meeting the missionaries outdoors, wary of what their presence might carry. Whether the motive was fear of magic, fear of trickery, or a desire to stay under the open sky of an older, sky-centered sacred imagination, the setting itself captures a society standing on a threshold. Old beliefs, still active, new ones arriving with confident symbols and disciplined ritual. Ethelbert was not entirely unprepared for Christianity. He had been married for years to Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess, under an agreement that allowed her to keep her faith and household clergy. That arrangement placed Christian worship and Christian language inside a pagan court long before public conversion. When Augustine's party finally met the king, the encounter unfolded with ceremony, singing, a raised cross, and an image of Christ carried as a focal point. The missionaries had expected hostility. Earlier reports had painted the English as fierce and alien, and Augustine himself had once hesitated, nearly turning back. Yet the first decisive political response in Kent was not violent rejection but cautious permission, supplies, a base in Canterbury, and leave to preach. The king eventually accepted baptism, and mass baptisms followed. Figures in later tradition rise into the tens of thousands within a year. Numbers that may reflect triumphal reporting as much as exact counting, but still point to the speed of visible change. From Kent, Christianity moved outward into other kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, advancing unevenly, sometimes stalling, sometimes reversing. Powerful rulers could relapse into older practices. Court politics and regional alliances could pull belief in different directions. Still, by the time of the Synod of Whitby in AD 664, the broad claim that the English were Christian had become plausible on a national scale. Yet conversion did not simply replace one set of ideas with another. It also changed the machinery that carried culture. In the pagan period, society was bound by rigid roles, with duties understood as part of fate and custom. After conversion, a new professional class gained authority. Priests and bishops trained in words, doctrine, and written transmission. With them came a new economy of knowledge, books. For centuries, literacy, copying, and formal learning were tied closely to church institutions. That shift mattered because the older English had their own thriving tradition of spoken art. Their poems and stories were shaped for memory, patterned, alliterative, musical. Skilled performers, Scots and wandering singers, could hold astonishing amounts of material in their heads and reshape it creatively in performance. In that world, poetry was not a rare luxury. It was a core technology for preserving lore, history, genealogy, and myth. Modern societies, saturated with print and screens, can struggle to imagine how strong, trained memory can be when it is the primary archive. In early England, the ability to write could seem almost supernatural, because writing meant carving symbols, often runes, into wood, stone, bone, or metal. But the absence of widespread writing did not mean the absence of complex thought. Stories, legal formulas, and genealogies could travel through generations by voice, often set into rhythm to give memory a structure to grip. Poets held a special status because they were an exception to the normal rule of fixed trades. In a hall at a feast, a harp could pass from hand to hand, and it could be a private embarrassment to refuse a turn because no song came to mind. Kings and nobles sang as well as commoners. Skill with words signalled standing just as surely as skill with weapons. This is one reason the old mythology did not vanish cleanly when Christian teachers tried to stamp it out. Clerics could control what was copied into books, but they could not easily erase what lived in performance, rumour, proverb, and half-remembered tale. Over time, a common pattern appeared. Stories of gods and heroes survived, but the gods themselves were pushed out of respectable writing. In the new Christian framing, old deities could be recast as demonic forces or dangerous illusions. Even so, heroic language sometimes flowed toward Christ in ways that reveal the older poetic instincts still at work. A converted poet might sing in Christian terms while still relying on inherited patterns of heroism, battle, loyalty, and doom. The loss of pagan material was made worse by later historical disasters. When monastic libraries were broken up and destroyed in England, vast amounts of writing vanished, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through indifference, sometimes through crude reuse as scrap. Accounts from the period describe books used for wiping, wrapping, cleaning, or sold away in bulk. Whatever the exaggerations, the result is undeniable. Only a tiny number of manuscripts preserve Old English poetry, and the survival of specific works often looks like pure accident. Fragments turn up in strange places, and entire epics can disappear almost completely, leaving only a few dozen lines behind. That makes reconstruction of Anglo-Saxon mythology resemble detective work. The clues are scattered. Some are obvious, like place names and day names that still carry the echoes of gods. Others survive as disguised motifs inside Christian texts, where the surface theology is new but older concepts flicker underneath. Folklore keeps more traces. Stories of a supernatural smith, wild riders in the night sky, witches and enchanted hunts. Art and archaeology also help. Carved scenes on objects, patterns on weapons, decorative panels and prestigious burial finds, all hinting at mythic reference points that writing avoids naming. One towering exception is Beowulf, preserved against almost ridiculous odds, surviving time, political upheaval, and even fire damage that scorched and crumbled parts of its pages. The poem is explicitly Christian in its moral voice and occasional references to God, yet its world is unmistakably pagan and non-English, set among Danes, Geats, and Swedes, with a heroic code that predates the Church's dominance. A young warrior crosses the sea to face a night-stalking monster that has been killing retainers in a king's hall. The struggle is violent and physical, benches overturned, timbers splintered. The monster flees mortally wounded, leaving a dark trail into the marshes. Then comes vengeance from the monster's mother and a second descent into an eerie waterside realm. In old age, the hero becomes a king and finally dies after fighting a dragon, saving his people at the cost of his own life. His followers burn his body and raise a great mound, a funeral gesture that feels rooted in older ritual memory. The poem's date places it near the conversion period, when older ideas were still close enough to be remembered vividly. That proximity makes its silences meaningful. A poet capable of preserving complex historical detail from the continent could easily have recorded recent pagan myths in full. The refusal to do so looks deliberate. and yet the poem cannot entirely suppress the older worldview. One of the clearest surviving traces is the concept of fate, known in Old English as wyrd. Wyrd appears repeatedly in early poetry as an overwhelming power, sometimes described in ways that make it feel almost personal, almost godlike. The tension is obvious. Christianity insists on a single omnipotent God, yet older lines sometimes sound as if fate stands above everything, even above gods. During the transition, texts can carry both claims at once, an unstable balance that cannot last forever. Over time, the Christian solution becomes predictable. Fate is reinterpreted as a providence, absorbed into God's will, or reduced to a harmless word for what happens. But earlier material suggests that wyrd once meant something stronger, older, and darker. Language offers a clue. Certain poetic phrases describe victory as something woven, and to a listener trained in the old mythic logic, that metaphor points toward the ancient image of fate as a weaver. In many Indo-European traditions, destiny is imagined as thread and cloth, spun, measured, and cut. In this older pattern, fate is not simply a vague principle. It is a force with agency, pictured as a set of sisters who shape life as fabric. Christianity could keep the poetry of weaving while trying to drain it of its pagan implications. But the metaphor itself is a fossil. It preserves the outline of an older belief. Later, English literature shows how long that belief could live underground. In early modern drama, weird sisters stand at the edge of history, predicting and steering events, surrounded by darkness and storm. Their name links back to older forms of wyrd, and their role echoes the ancient fates of broader Indo-European tradition. Northern mythology preserves the pattern more openly. Three sisters associated with time and destiny, connected to a sacred tree and a well, maintaining the world's order through ritual care. Classical sources carry comparable figures as well. Three powers who spin, measure, and cut life's thread, binding human existence to cosmic rhythm. Taken together, these parallels suggest that the Anglo-Saxons once knew a richer, more developed fate myth than surviving Old English texts are willing to state plainly. The Church's control over writing helped suppress the names and details, but suppression is not the same as erasure. Ideas can vanish from books while remaining alive in speech, metaphor, and story patterns, only resurfacing centuries later when literature becomes more secular and less tightly policed by religious institutions. Many religions describe the divine in family terms. Some speak of a god who is a father, others of a goddess who is a mother. Motherhood is immediately visible, while fatherhood requires understanding. A child learns the word father early, but the reason behind it is usually explained much later. This knowledge, however obvious it seems today, is not universal across human cultures. There have been societies in which the role of the male in conception was denied or ignored. Among certain indigenous groups in Australia, men were not believed to take part in creating children. On the Trobriand Islands, the language itself lacks a word for father because the idea was not recognised. Sexual relations were understood as pleasure or companionship, rather than reproduction. Similar misunderstandings existed even in Europe within living memory, where young women were once told that pregnancy could result from a kiss alone. In such cultural settings, it was logical to imagine a divine family made up of a mother and her child, without the need for a father. This pattern appears repeatedly in ancient religions. Yet the Indo-European peoples had moved beyond this stage by at least 6,000 years ago. They understood that every child had a father, and they shaped their religious imagination accordingly. Their gods formed a family headed not by a mother, but by a father figure. This father was identified with the sky. The original name of this sky father was never written down directly, but it can be reconstructed through its descendants in later languages. Across the Indo-European world, similar names appear. In Sanskrit, there is Daios, in Greek Zeus, and in Latin Jovis. These names are closely related and share the same meaning. They refer to brightness, splendor, and shining height. In other words, they refer to the sky itself. When combined with local words for father, they produce titles meaning sky father. Because this figure appears among Indians, Greeks, and Romans, it would be remarkable if the northern branches of the Indo-European world had forgotten him entirely. Northern Europe was not an isolated fringe. Its peoples belonged fully to the same linguistic and cultural family. Evidence suggests that they too remembered the Sky Father, though under a different name. Among the early peoples of northwestern Europe, that name was Tiwaz. This god was known by related forms across Germanic lands. Among the Germans he was Zeus. In Scandinavia he was Tyr. In England he was called Tew. These names are not coincidental. They point to a shared origin, and that origin aligns closely with the ancient Sky Father known elsewhere. Some scholars have argued that the word behind these names simply meant God, in a general sense. Even if that were true, the argument still leads to the same conclusion. In traditional religions, when someone speaks of the God without qualification, they almost always mean the highest God. The linguistic evidence does not weaken the case for Tiwaz as the Sky Father. It strengthens it. Place names provide some of the strongest support. Across Germany, Denmark, Sweden, England, and Norway, ancient settlements and landscape features preserve forms of Tiu's name. Hills, villages, clearings, and regions were named after him. This wide distribution shows that he was not a minor or local spirit. He was once central. The absence of such names in Iceland tells another part of the story, suggesting that by the time Iceland was settled, devotion to Tiw had already declined. This decline is also visible in the calendar. Tiw gave his name to the third day of the week, which survives today as Tuesday. When Roman naming conventions were adopted, this day was aligned with Mars, the Roman god of war. This tells an important story. It shows that by the early centuries of the Christian era, Tiw was no longer viewed primarily as a sky god. He had been redefined as a god of war. Once the chief god loses his position, another must replace him. Among the northern peoples, that role was taken by Woden. Over time, Woden absorbed many of the functions and stories that had once belonged to the Sky Father. This process was gradual and uneven, varying from region to region. Traces of the older Sky Father survived, but often in distorted form. In later Scandinavian tradition, a mysterious figure known as the All-Father appears. He is described as having existed from the beginning of time, as the creator of heaven and earth, and as the ruler of all things. He governs the movement of stars, winds, rain, and growth. He gives life to humanity and controls the structure of the cosmos. At the same time, later storytellers increasingly identified this All-Father with Woden. This created confusion. Woden was not eternal. He had parents. He was subject to fate. He did not rule with absolute power. These contradictions suggest that two distinct figures had been merged into one. The older figure was the Sky Father. The newer figure was the god who replaced him. Stories preserved in northern myth still carry fragments of the older worldview. Tales of night and day travelling across the sky in chariots, driven by horses whose breath forms dew and whose shining manes light the world, belong to a very ancient tradition. These stories are not unique to Scandinavia. Similar images appear in Greek, Roman, and Indian myth. Archaeology confirms this continuity. A Bronze Age sun chariot found in Denmark shows the sun carried across the heavens by a horse, exactly as described in later stories. Other myths speak of the sun and moon being chased by wolves, threatened with destruction. In later northern tradition, this becomes part of a dramatic vision of the end of the world. Yet the core image is much older. It reflects the daily disappearance of the sun and its return, explained through mythic struggle rather than astronomy. The Sky Father appears again in stories of sacrifice and loss. In one myth, a god gives up an eye in exchange for wisdom. This image reflects the setting sun, swallowed by darkness, only to return renewed. The language of myth transforms natural cycles into acts of divine drama. These ideas did not vanish entirely when Christianity arrived. They survived in altered forms, hidden within folklore, ritual, and art. Even after conversion, people continued to tell stories, perform symbolic acts, and preserve images whose meaning stretched far beyond their new religious framework. One striking example comes from early medieval England, where a great ship burial was uncovered beneath a mound overlooking a river. The vessel itself had long decayed, but its outline remained in the soil. Inside were weapons, treasures, ceremonial objects, and a helmet decorated with powerful imagery. Among these decorations were figures that appear to show a human form being swallowed by animals resembling wolves. Such imagery closely parallels northern myths of a god consumed by a monster. Official interpretations have sometimes explained these designs as borrowed Christian symbols, but the resemblance to Scandinavian art and older mythic themes is too close to ignore. These images point toward a shared tradition, reshaped over centuries but never fully erased. The ship burial also echoes descriptions found in early heroic poetry, where kings are sent to the sea accompanied by treasures, weapons, and symbols of authority. The similarity between archaeology and poetry suggests that these were not abstract stories, but lived traditions. As the old Sky Father faded from prominence, Woden rose to dominance. Unlike the distant sky god, Woden was imagined as a wanderer, a figure who moved through the human world. He was associated with gallows, battlefields, crossroads, and the restless dead. He was seen as a leader of spirits, guiding lost souls across the sky in a wild procession. This belief survived well into the Christian period, reinterpreted but never entirely suppressed. Tales of ghostly hunts, spectral riders, and howling hounds persisted in folklore across England and beyond. Even modern stories and songs echo these ancient themes, showing how deeply they had entered the imagination. Woden was also remembered as a master of hidden knowledge. He was linked to magic, prophecy, and the casting of lots. Ancient descriptions tell of branches marked with signs and thrown upon cloth, then read according to patterns believed to reflect divine will. Such practices were not marginal. They were central to decision-making in matters both public and private. This combination of wisdom, death, movement, and mystery set Woden apart from the older Sky Father. Where the sky god governed cycles and order, Woden ruled change, fate, and uncertainty. His rise marked a shift in values toward war, leadership, and survival in a harsher world. Yet beneath Woden's dominance, the older figure never vanished completely. Fragments remained in language, in art, in seasonal rituals, and in stories that no longer named their original subject. The swallowing of the sun, the binding of monsters, the loss and recovery of divine power all point back to an earlier vision of the cosmos. What survives today is not a complete system, but a layered one. Beneath the surface of later myth and Christian reinterpretation lies an older structure, shaped by Indo-European ideas of sky, fatherhood, fate, and renewal. Through careful comparison of language, story, and material remains, that structure can still be glimpsed. The transformation of the Sky Father into a war god, and his eventual replacement by a wandering god of wisdom and death, reflects not only religious change but social change. As societies shifted toward conflict and expansion, their gods changed with them. The heavens remained, but attention turned from the sky itself to the forces believed to move unseen through the world below. The origins of the runic symbols no longer belong to the realm of speculation. Their earliest history has become increasingly clear. The peoples of Northern Europe did not invent these signs in isolation. They received them through contact with the cultures of Northern Italy, and from the very beginning their purpose was not practical writing. Runes were born as instruments of magic. They were used to seek knowledge hidden from ordinary sight, to cast lots, to shape fate, and to communicate with unseen powers. Literacy came later. Divination came first. Among the gods of the northern world, one figure stands closer to the runes than any other. That figure is Woden. The connection is not a late invention or a poetic flourish. It appears firmly rooted in the earliest evidence available. In Old English tradition, the 9 herbs charm speaks of sacred twigs, fragments of wood carved with signs and endowed with power. These were not decorative marks, they were runes. In northern tradition, the same god appears under the name Odin, explicitly described as the discoverer of these symbols. In both worlds, separated by sea and centuries, the same idea remains unchanged. Woden is the god who gains wisdom through sacrifice and gives that wisdom to humankind. This association between Woden and knowledge is not the result of later embellishment. It belongs to the core of his character. Old English verse preserves a vision of a god who hangs upon the tree of chaos, shaping herbs and setting them into the structure of the worlds, so that both rich and poor might be aided. In northern poetry, the image is even starker. Odin speaks in his own voice, describing how he hung for 9 nights upon the wind-swept tree, wounded by a blade, starving and thirsting, offering himself to himself. No bread was given. No drink was offered. Only through suffering did he glimpse the runes. When he seized them, he fell back to the ground, transformed by what he had learned. Whether this image of divine self-sacrifice developed independently, or was later reshaped under the influence of Christian stories, is difficult to determine. What can be said with certainty is that the Old English world already regarded Woden as a god of wisdom long before conversion. Christian writers later attempted to undermine this image by twisting wisdom into deceit and cleverness into trickery. Yet even in their hostility, they preserved older truths. They remembered that sacrifices to Woden were made by hanging, especially at crossroads. They remembered that death itself belonged to his domain. Northern tradition expands this picture dramatically. In the poetic heritage of Scandinavia, Odin becomes Lord of the Slain. Warriors who die bravely in battle are said to be gathered into his hall, Valhalla, a place described with vivid and violent detail. Its roof is made of shields. Its beams are spears. Over its gate hangs a wolf, watched by an eagle. Every day Odin chooses those who will fall in battle. When they arrive, they pass through a sacred gate known only to the dead, and wade through a roaring river of air before entering the hall. Inside, the fallen warriors feast and fight without end. Their meat comes from a magical boar that is slaughtered each night and reborn each morning. Their drink flows from a goat whose udders pour out mead. By day, they arm themselves and clash in combat. By evening, they are healed and sit together in celebration. This image of eternal struggle is powerful, but it does not appear consistently in the earliest sources. In fact, the idea of endless battle seems to have existed separately from the concept of Valhalla before later traditions fused them together. Over time, these elements merged into a larger and darker vision of cosmic destruction, known as Ragnarok. Odin's connection with the dead extends beyond Valhalla. He is accompanied by female figures who choose those destined to die. These beings, later known as Valkyries, appear in different forms across the sources. In later poetry, they resemble noble warrior women, serving drink and riding splendid horses. Yet older names reveal a far more terrifying origin. Their titles mean shrieker, screamer, raging one. In early skaldic verse, they weave the fabric of war from human entrails, weighting their looms with severed heads and shooting arrows as shuttles. Victory and defeat are not earned, they are assigned. Anglo-Saxon England preserved a darker memory still. The Old English term related to the Valkyrie was not a noble figure, but a fearsome one, equated with the ancient Greek spirits of vengeance. These beings rode noisily across the land, howling and hurling spears, connected not with glory but with graves. They were witches, death women, companions of slaughter. In charms and poems they appear as wild forces barely restrained, closer to demons than heroines. This difference matters. It suggests that the Anglo-Saxon Woden never fully developed into the refined war king of Viking imagination. He was not a ruler seated in golden armour commanding legions of chosen dead. He was a wanderer, one-eyed and hooded, encountered on lonely roads and at gallows. In calm weather he walked the downs, recognising himself in the bodies of the hanged. In storms he roared through the sky at the head of the wild hunt, leading the restless dead across the clouds. This transformation of Woden did not happen in isolation. He inherited traits from an older god, Tiwaz, the ancient sky father of northwestern Europe. Early evidence suggests that both gods once stood side by side. Roman observers recorded that northern tribes dedicated defeated enemies to both figures at once. Entire armies, their horses, weapons, and possessions were destroyed as offerings. No spoils were kept. Everything was annihilated. Archaeology has given physical form to these accounts. In the bogs of Denmark, bodies have been found preserved for 2,000 years. They were hanged, naked, sometimes wounded, sometimes accompanied by others. These were not criminals or accidents. They were ritual victims. Their deaths align closely with ancient descriptions of sacrificial destruction offered to the gods of death and war. The evidence suggests that Woden was already rising in prominence by the 1st century, challenging the authority of the old Sky Father. As Woden gained power, another god emerged alongside him. This was Thuna, the god of thunder. His name means exactly that. He was a storm god, a protector of crops and cattle, a force of raw strength. His origins stretch far beyond northern Europe. Similar figures appear among Indo-European peoples. From India to Anatolia, the Hindu Indra and the Hittite weather god share his red hair, his thunder weapon, and his role as serpent slayer. In the lands along the Rhine, Saxons came into contact with Celtic worship of a thunderous form of Jupiter. From this contact, Thunor took his name. Over time, he displaced older weather gods and absorbed traits once belonging to the Sky Father himself. The boundaries between sky and storm blurred. Thunor rose as a champion of ordinary people, fighting famine, disease, and chaos. Place names across England preserve his memory. Oaks were sacred to him, often struck by lightning, seen as sites of divine presence. His weapon, imagined as a hammer or axe, echoes ancient symbols found across Europe and the Near East. It was believed to return to his hand after being thrown, leaving destruction behind but never lost. In Scandinavia, Thunor became Thor. His myths were elaborated, his family expanded, his battles dramatized. He fought the world serpent, the embodiment of chaos, in a struggle tied to the renewal of the year. This combat was more than entertainment, it was ritual. It symbolized the defeat of winter and the rebirth of the land. England likely knew versions of this story. A carved stone cross in the north depicts the fishing of the world serpent, suggesting that the myth survived into the Viking Age and was reintroduced by Norse settlers. The story's bones are ancient, even if later poets refined its humour and detail. As Christianity spread, Thunor resisted longer than most gods. His cult travelled northward with migrating peoples, surviving in Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and even reaching North America with explorers who still trusted his power. Yet eventually he too fell. Missionaries cut down his sacred oaks. Kings shattered his shrines. The white Christ replaced the red-bearded God. What remains is memory, names carved into landscapes, stories embedded in poetry, bodies preserved in bogs, symbols etched into stone. Together they reveal a world where gods were not distant ideals, but forces embedded in weather, war, and death. Woden, Thunor, and the older Skyfather were not abstract beliefs. They were explanations for thunder, famine, victory, and loss. They shaped how people lived, fought, sacrificed, and understood their place in a violent and uncertain world. Thor cut off the ox's head and carried it down to the shore, where Hymir was already pushing the boat into the water. As Thor stepped aboard, he settled himself heavily at the bottom, took up a pair of oars, and began to row. Despite the force of his strokes, Hymir thought their progress painfully slow. From the prow, the giant pulled harder, trying to quicken the pace. At last, he announced that they had reached the fishing grounds where he normally caught flatfish. Thor objected at once and insisted they row much farther out to sea. Reluctantly, Hymir agreed, and they continued onward. After a while, Hymir warned that they had gone far enough. Beyond this point, he said, it was dangerous to linger because of the world serpent that haunted the deep. Thor ignored the warning and demanded that they row on a little longer. This time Hymir yielded without protest. Thor then dropped his oars and prepared his fishing gear. The rod he produced was enormous and the hook was massive and strong. He fixed the ox's head onto it as bait and cast the line overboard, letting it sink down into the depths. There was an unspoken truth behind Thor's calm. During an earlier encounter, when the world serpent had been disguised as a cat, Thor had not truly been fooled when he tried to lift it. Loki had turned the moment into mockery, but Thor had never forgotten. Now, the serpent swallowed the bait eagerly, but the hook caught fast in its throat. When the creature realized this, it lashed about with such violence that Thor's wrists were scraped raw against the gunwale. Rage surged through the god. He summoned all his strength, braced his feet against the bottom of the boat, and hauled with such force that the serpent was dragged up to the surface. No sight was ever more terrifying. Thor stared down as the world serpent rose from below, glaring back and spewing clouds of venom. At that moment, Hymir lost his nerve. His face drained of colour as waves poured into the boat and the hull creaked under the strain. Thor seized his hammer and raised it high, preparing the killing blow. But Hymir, trembling with fear, fumbled for his knife and hacked through the fishing line. The serpent plunged back into the depths, disappearing beneath the sea. Thor stood there, hammer raised, while people later argued over what might have happened had the blow fallen. Some believed the god would have smashed the monster's head and saved the world from its doom. Others believed the serpent was fated to survive, coiled forever at the bottom of the ocean. In fury, Thor turned on Hymir, fixed him with a terrible stare, and hurled him overboard. the last thing Thor saw of the giant was the soles of his feet vanishing beneath the waves. Then, Thor waded back to shore. This story offers a clear example of how ancient myth adapts itself to environment. Thor has been reshaped into a figure familiar to coastal peoples, resembling a rugged fisherman from northern seas. The storyteller lingers over practical details, knives, bait, raw hands scraped against wood, grounding the myth in everyday experience. More importantly, the ending itself has been altered. The struggle is left unresolved. In older tradition, Thor and the world serpent meet again in a final and fatal encounter. By the time that version took shape, northern peoples had fully embraced a vision of cosmic destruction. As this worldview hardened, poets reshaped the myth so that both god and monster were doomed. In later retellings, the serpent is slain, but Thor dies as well. Snorri preserves this ending in his account of Ragnarok, the final collapse of the divine order. Yet even as he tells it, he unknowingly preserves much older elements. He records, for example, that the ox Thor used as bait bore the name Heavenspringer, a name filled with sky symbolism. Elsewhere, he mentions a figure called Cloud Calf and notes, with odd specificity, that this creature lost control in fear. Evidence suggests that earlier English tradition preserved the myth in its older form, with Thor as the victor. A scene carved on several stone crosses from northern England appears to reflect another episode from the same mythic cycle. These crosses, carved from the same stone and likely produced by the same workshop shortly after the year 1000, all display a curious scene. Within a circular frame, one figure bends forward, with its head resting in the lap of another. The central figure raises a staff and touches the bowed head, while a third figure looks on. This scene can be interpreted as the moment following Thor's battle with the stone giant, Hrungnir. During that fight, a fragment of the giant's whetstone lodged in Thor's skull. A wise woman named Groa attempted to remove it through enchantment. The staff held by the central figure resembles the emblem of a seeress, suggesting that this carving preserves the memory of that healing attempt. Snorri's version of the story unfolds with vivid drama. Odin, riding his 8-legged horse, drew the attention of Hrungnir when light flashed from his golden helmet. A race followed between their mounts, ending with both leaping over the walls of the god's stronghold. Hrungnir was granted hospitality but soon grew boastful and drunk, threatening to carry off the goddesses. Thor was summoned and a duel was arranged. The giants, fearing for their champion, created a helper from clay, a towering figure called Cloud Calf. A horse's heart was placed inside it, but it quailed at Thor's approach. Hrungnir himself stood ready with shield and whetstone. When Thor's hammer flew, Hrungnir hurled the whetstone in return. The two collided, shattering the stone. A fragment struck Thor down, but the hammer crushed Hrungnir's head. The giant fell, trapping Thor beneath his leg. Only Thor's infant son, Magni, could lift the limb and free his father. Thor returned home with the stone still lodged in his head. When Groa resumed her spell, Thor distracted her by telling her that he had carried her husband home from the giant lands and cast his frozen toe into the sky as a star. Overjoyed, Groa forgot her spell, and the stone remained. This story, tangled with layers of older myth, was clearly known in England. The Frank's casket, carved around the year 700, depicts Orvandil defending his home. His name appears directly on the object, confirming the identity. The same figure survives in English tradition as the Morning Star, showing that the myth belongs to a shared northern heritage. Thor himself emerges from these stories as one of the most fully realized gods of Northern Europe. His roots stretch back to Indo-European antiquity. though his name was shaped in the Rhine lands where Saxons and Celts met. Red-haired and immensely strong, he ruled storms and protected the world from giants. His hammer embodied thunder and lightning. Despite his fearsome temper, he was always believed to favour humankind. As peoples migrated, Thor's worship travelled north and west. In Scandinavia he flourished, though in some regions he later yielded prominence to other gods. Even so, his hold remained strong in Norway and Iceland, and his name reached Greenland and beyond. Though later poets claimed he perished at the world's end, earlier belief held that he overcame the serpent. Historically, his decline came not through myth, but through conversion, as the old gods gave way to the new faith. Frigg presents a different challenge. Little survives from English sources, largely because the Church allowed no rival to its own sacred mother. Still, her importance is clear. One day of the week bears her name, aligning her with love and fertility. Place names, scattered across England, suggest sites once dedicated to her. Her name means beloved. She appears as the wife of the chief god and the mother of the divine family. In later tradition, she is also linked to the earth itself. These identities overlap until Frigg and Earth become indistinguishable. Ancient English ritual confirms the worship of Earth as the giver of fertility, hailed as the mother of men and invoked to bless the fields. Classical writers describe tribes who worshipped a goddess, drawn in a sacred wagon, bringing peace wherever she travelled. One of those tribes later became part of the English people. This confirms that reverence for Earth predates migration to Britain. Long before patriarchal systems took root, the Earth Mother held supreme authority. Across the ancient world, she appeared under many names, always accompanied by a youthful consort who died with the year and returned in spring. This pattern spread from the Near East into Europe, reshaping local beliefs. Norse tradition places Frey and his sister Freya within a distinct divine family. Their father is named Njord, and the striking detail is what is not said. A mother is never clearly given. Together, father and the two children belong to the Vanir, a group openly treated as separate in origin from the Aesir, the better-known gods of the northern stories. Most surviving material about the Vanir comes from Icelandic and Scandinavian writing, so a modern reader could easily assume this cult was limited to the far north. Yet the trail runs wider and it runs earlier. The name Njord itself points toward an older layer. It mirrors a figure described by Roman writers under the name Nerthus, a sacred Mother Earth worshipped among northern peoples on the continent. That connection matters because one of the tribes listed among the worshippers is tied to the same population stream that later becomes part of early England. On that basis alone, it becomes plausible that communities in Anglo-Saxon England remembered, in some form, a divinity comparable to Scandinavian Njord. At first glance, the identification seems to wobble. Nerthus is presented as female and earth power. Njord, as later northern texts describe him, is male and closely linked to the sea. A late but influential account assigns him authority over wind, waves, and deep-sea fishing, and portrays sailors calling on him for safe landfall or profit. A verse even paints him as miserable when forced to live inland among mountains, away from the crash of surf and the cries of seabirds. And behind this newer sea lord, another, older sea power still lingers in northern memory. Aegir, a local Neptune-like figure associated with the deep, a presence among whales and strange creatures of the ocean. That suggests a layered religious landscape where different divine roles overlap, compete, and trade attributes. Yet the mismatch between Nerthus and Njord has an explanation that fits the broader pattern of how myth shifts under social pressure. Nerthus belongs to a cult centered on a powerful female figure. Njord appears in a world that has become decisively patriarchal. In such a setting, it is not difficult to imagine a tradition altering the sex of a divinity, reshaping the figure into male so that the cult sits more comfortably inside a male-dominated order. Changes like this are not rare in myth. The surrounding society pushes, and the story yields. Once a mother figure is recast as a father, the family structure must also be rewritten. That helps explain why Frey and Freya are left with no clear mother in later northern storytelling. In an earlier form, the child of the Earth Mother could exist without a named father. In a patriarchal retelling, the parent who is missing is the mother, because the old mother has been transformed into the new father. Geography reinforces the same transformation. Peoples of Denmark and Scandinavia lived close to the sea, often depending on it not only for food but for wealth, whether through fishing or raiding. Plenty and fertility meant grain and livestock, but it also meant nets heavy with catch and ships returning loaded. In that world, an earth fertility figure can become a combined minister of harvest and the sea, a power who governs both the field and the waves. Over time, the seaward aspect grows larger, because daily life pushes it forward. The result is Njord as the sea god of later accounts, even if an older sea god once held that place. Even so, older feminine elements keep pressing back into view. As Njord becomes more and more maritime, fertility traits drift toward a son. Frey. That still does not fully satisfy the underlying shape of the old myth, because the Great Mother does not vanish easily. She reappears even within patriarchal tradition as Freya, now described as Njord's daughter and Frey's sister. The process reaches its final turn when Freya becomes closely linked with Frigg, and the Earth Mother's preeminence returns under new names, now set beside the Skyfather in the familiar northern divine household. A narrative preserved in the saga material makes the transfer of the old Earth Mother mantle especially clear. It tells of Gunnar Helming, a man who flees Norway after being accused of killing and seeks refuge in Sweden at the sanctuary of Frey. The shrine holds an idol believed to speak, tended by a young priestess treated as the god's wife. Frey himself is carried in a wagon during the dark season to secure fertility for the year, and the community follows, singing, feasting, and taking the god's presence as a promise that life will renew itself. A storm breaks the procession. The draft animal collapses, and Gunnar is urged to take over the leading role. He struggles, fails, then continues, fearing the god's anger. The idol descends from the cart, and a fight begins between God and man. In desperation, Gunnar vows that if he survives, he will return home, reconcile with King Olaf, and accept Christianity. After the vow, he overpowers the idol, drives out what the story calls an evil spirit, and shatters the image. The priestess then helps him disguise himself in the god's clothing, and together they continue the journey. From that point, the tale becomes almost satirical in tone. The false Frey now walks, eats, drinks, collects gifts of gold, and speaks little except to his wife. The pair move from farm to farm through winter. The weather improves, and people interpret the priestess's pregnancy as a sign of divine blessing. Reports spread, reach Norway, and eventually reach King Olaf, who recognizes the deception and sends a pardon. Gunnar and the priestess escape, carrying as much treasure as they can. Even with its late, Christian-coloured twist, the core of the episode matches the older continental picture. A divinity associated with fertility is taken from place to place in a wagon. Wherever the wagon stops, there is feasting. The purpose is prosperity, renewal, peace, and a good season. That is the same structure described for Nerthus. The details differ, the names shift, and the gender of the divinity has been rearranged by the time the story is written down, but the skeleton remains. The simplest reading is that the old Nerthus-type mantle has passed to Frey in the northern setting. Beyond this, other clues suggest that the English-speaking world carried related memories. Frey's very name means lord, and Freya's means lady, titles that echo a wider pattern seen in ancient fertility cults across many regions. In Sweden, Frey is closely linked with the name Yngvi, and his line is remembered as the Ynglings, a royal lineage traced back to him. A parallel appears in England in the name Ing, a figure remembered in old tradition as having once been seen among the East Danes, and then departing across the waves in a wagon. That single image, a divine figure tied to the people, travelling by wagon, then disappearing over the sea, fits too closely to the Nerthus pattern to ignore. It also resonates with the broader theme of a vegetation power, who leaves and returns with the season. Language preserves further shadows. The word lord in English poetry is often Freya, a term used so frequently that it becomes almost transparent, a normal label for a ruler. In Christian poetry, it can be transferred to Christ, a sign that older titles did not disappear but were redirected. This replacement is not random. It follows the pattern of conversion, where old terms survive as shells filled with new meaning. Peace and plenty also cling to the same cluster of ideas. Classical description links Nerthus with a sacred time when weapons are put away and conflict pauses. Northern tradition similarly associates Frey with peace and abundant seasons. A later writer even describes how world peace was proclaimed under a Roman emperor at the time of Christ's birth, and then notes how northern people attach the name of a powerful king to the concept of peace, blending Christian and older cultural memories. The result is a landscape where older fertility peace ideas persist, but their labels keep changing. The story of Frey's longing for the giant maiden Gerda shows the same mythic machinery at work. Frey sees her from afar, is overwhelmed, and falls into a silence so deep that he will not sleep, eat, or speak. His father Njord sends Skirnir, a trusted attendant, to discover the cause. Frey admits his desire and demands that Gerda be won for him, offering rich rewards. Skirnir agrees, but only after bargaining, and Frey hands over a weapon that fights on its own. Skirnir travels, secures Gerda's promise to meet Frey after a set time, and returns with the news. Frey responds with the impatience of obsession. Even one night feels too long, he complains, and the waiting is agony. The myth explains, in its own symbolic way, why Frey later faces danger without his proper weapon. Under the surface, this is another version of the vegetation story. The beloved is absent, shut away, and must be brought back so that the world can renew itself. The roles have been rearranged for a patriarchal setting. In older fertility myths, the goddess often mourns a lost lover. Here, a male figure grieves for an unreachable bride. Even the location of their meeting is revealing. It is named with a word connected to barley or grain, as if the story cannot resist, leaving a farming imprint in the landscape. Archaeology supports this symbolic reading. Small gold plaques from Scandinavia show a man and woman facing one another, sometimes with a stalk of vegetation between them. It is not a proof in the courtroom sense, but it is hard to separate such images from the theme of fertility, courtship, and seasonal renewal that saturates the stories. Freya's surviving portrait in northern writing reinforces the same older pattern. She is praised above other women as a figure people call upon for help. She weeps for a husband or partner who wanders far away, and her tears become red gold. She bears many names explained as disguises used while searching among distant peoples. She owns a famous necklace, Brisingamen, rides in a car drawn by cats, and travels widely. Her titles and imagery place her in the familiar role of the Great Lady, the fertility power who mourns and seeks, who moves across the land and whose presence promises life. That necklace leads into another chain of myth. Its mention in heroic poetry presupposes an entire world of stories. Loki's theft, a recovery by a watchful god at the world's edge, and the return of the treasure to its rightful owner. In such tales, the stolen object stands in for the lost lover or the lost life force of the year. The same pattern appears when other goddesses lose fertility emblems, such as apples or golden hair. Different names, different scenes, the same underlying logic. Life disappears, the world wanes, then life returns and the world is restored. Two large mythic strategies run alongside one another across cultures. Sometimes the vegetation spirit is represented as the goddess's lover or possession and is lost or killed. At other times, the goddess herself descends, is imprisoned or vanishes, and nature collapses in her absence. One of the clearest early examples comes from Mesopotamian tradition, where the goddess descends into the realm of the dead. Gate by gate, she is stripped of crown, jewellery, and garments until she stands exposed and powerless before the queen below. Above ground, nature fails. Animals will not mate, humans will not couple. Fertility stops and growth withers. Only when the higher gods intervene and the goddess is released does life resume. On her return, her ornaments are restored. The story ends with a hint that her lost lover will also rise, accompanied by ritual music and mourning transformed into renewal. When this older pattern is placed beside northern and northwestern European material, the parallels become difficult to dismiss. Freya's searching and weeping, the wagon procession of a fertility power, the seasonal promise of a good year, and the way peace is tied to the deities' movement among people all belong to the same broad family of ideas. Even animal symbols align. In northern tradition, Frey and Freya are linked with boars, and Roman writers describe tribes who worship the mother of the gods and wear boar symbols as protective emblems. In England, boar-crested helmets and repeated references to the boar as a guardian figure show that the symbol had real cultural weight. Such signs suggest that the protection of the boar was not merely decoration, but a visible claim that the wearer stood under the shield of a fertility war guardian, plausibly linked to Frey or Freya in the older religious grammar. A more uncomfortable kind of evidence appears in medieval stone carving. Large female figures displayed on churches, marked by exaggerated sexuality, and sometimes paired with an animal-headed companion. These carvings do not sit easily within official Christian iconography. Their raw emphasis on fertility and the body runs against centuries of clerical discomfort with sexuality. Yet the figures are real, widespread, and often placed in the very centre of Christian spaces. Their later nickname, often tied to Celtic languages, has encouraged people to assume a specifically Celtic origin. But their distribution in England is broad and their persistence suggests long familiarity among English rural communities. Reports and local memories describe people making special visits to them, and in some cases reacting angrily when the figures were moved or removed. Taken at face value, such carvings can be understood as the great goddess, the Earth Mother, surviving in plain sight under a Christian roof. That survival would not be surprising in societies where everyday life still depended on fertility, livestock, harvest, and birth, and where older customs often endured by being ignored, tolerated, or reinterpreted, rather than fully erased. Modern revivals of witchcraft add a final, controversial echo. New groups describe rites that claim ancient roots, sometimes focused on healing rather than fertility, sometimes using symbolic language of drawing down a goddess into a priestess within a circle. Whether or not such movements truly connect to antiquity, their imagery demonstrates how durable the old idea remains. A female divine power descending, inhabiting, renewing, and directing human affairs. From the accumulation of these strands, a coherent picture emerges. Early English tradition likely did not preserve the names and stories in the neat form found in later Icelandic writing. But enough remains in names, titles, poetic usage, processional motifs, seasonal patterns, protective symbols, and stubborn folk survivals to support a strong conclusion. The Old English world knew a fertility complex centered on the Earth Mother and linked, in some form, to a lord and a lady, figures that Northern tradition later calls Frey and Freya, with Njord standing behind them as a transformed and reinterpreted continuation of the older Nerthus type. The story of the dying god who falls, disappears, and later returns to the living world is one of the oldest and most persistent ideas in human belief. In the northern lands, this story reaches its most emotional form in the figure of Balder. Yet Balder is not an isolated creation. His fate mirrors far older tales once told beneath the shadow of Babylonian temple towers, along the Nile beside the pyramids of Egypt, and in the shaded sanctuaries of ancient Greece. Tammuz, Osiris, and Adonis all follow the same pattern. A radiant figure bound to life itself, struck down, mourned, and restored. There would be little reason to explore this myth in detail if it were not clear that the early English world knew it well. Balder's name itself seems to have faded from everyday speech, yet traces linger in the landscape. Place names preserve echoes where memory endured longer in remote regions than in settled centres. Villages at the edge of moorland, valleys once associated with hidden beings, and locations remembered for ancient spirits, all suggest a countryside that retained older beliefs long after official religion had changed. Other Anglo-Saxon place names point even more directly to Balder, especially if early charms and spells are trusted, where Balder and another divine figure appear to merge into a single presence. Taken together, these signs suggest that Balder was not a foreign import from Scandinavia, but a figure already known and understood. The name Balder itself means Lord. This alone links him directly to his Near Eastern counterparts. The god known to the Greeks as Adonis received his name from a word meaning my lord, just as later religious traditions would use the same title for their own central figure. In Old English poetry, the name Balder appears not as a proper noun, but as a title meaning ruler or lord, used in elevated verse. The same word appears again and again as a poetic synonym for authority. This overlap is not accidental. It reveals how easily divine titles pass from one belief system to another while retaining emotional power. To understand how this myth reached the northern world, it is necessary to begin with its older form. In the Greek story, Adonis is born extraordinarily beautiful and is hidden away to protect him. Two goddesses come to desire him, one ruling the world above and the other reigning below. A compromise is reached, dividing his time between life, death, and solitude. Each year, while hunting, Adonis is wounded by a wild boar. His blood drains into the earth, and flowers rise where it falls, and rivers run red. His lover mourns him bitterly until the season turns and he returns once more. This story was not merely told, it was enacted. In Greek cities, women carried small symbolic gardens representing fertility and loss. In some sanctuaries, sexual union itself became part of ritual practice, not as indulgence, but as an attempt to influence the natural world through imitation. Death and return were not abstract ideas. They were lived experiences tied to the rhythm of crops, seasons, and human survival. The essential elements of this myth remain constant. A beloved young figure bound to beauty and promise. A violent wound and a bloody death. A descent into the realm of the dead. Mourning by those left behind. And finally, return. When the same story appears in the north, it takes on a harsher tone. In the account preserved in medieval Iceland, Balder begins to dream of his own death. These dreams alarm the gods, who attempt to protect him by extracting promises from everything in existence never to harm him. Fire, water, stone, metal, disease, animals, and poisons all swear obedience. Confident in this protection, the gods turn Balder into a living target, throwing weapons at him for amusement as they bounce harmlessly away. Only one thing is overlooked: a young sprout of mistletoe, deemed too small and harmless to matter. This omission proves fatal. Through deception, the blind god is guided to throw the mistletoe at Balder. The shaft strikes true. Balder falls dead, and silence spreads through the divine assembly. Grief overwhelms the gods. Their protection has failed. Nothing can undo what has happened. Balder's body is carried to the shore and placed upon his great ship, the largest vessel ever built. His funeral becomes a spectacle of cosmic scale. Giants are summoned to set the ship in motion. Fire consumes the vessel. Balder's wife collapses in grief and is burned beside him. Even the gods struggle to restrain their rage as the flames rise. Yet death is not the end. A messenger rides to the realm of the dead to plead for Balder's return. The queen of that realm agrees on one condition: every being in existence must mourn him. Messengers spread across the worlds and everything weeps. Stones release moisture, trees shed sap, metal drips as it warms. Only one figure refuses. Because of that single refusal, Balder remains among the dead. At this point, the northern version breaks sharply from the older myth. There is no immediate return. The god remains lost. The world moves toward catastrophe. This change reflects the world that shaped the story. The early farming societies that first told the myth depended on predictable seasons and renewal. But the later northern world had changed. Life revolved increasingly around the sea, warfare, and sudden death. Violence became constant. Stability vanished. In such a world, the promise of return no longer felt certain. The myth adapted. The god died and stayed dead. Yet the older truth refused to disappear entirely. Even in the northern poems, hints remain. At the end of time, after the destruction of gods and world alike, a new earth rises. Fields grow without being sown. Illness fades, and Balder returns. This return is quiet, almost reluctant, placed among lesser figures rather than at the centre. But it is there. The tradition was too strong to erase. The question then arises, was this story known in early England? Evidence suggests it was. A Christian poem composed in Old English long before large-scale Scandinavian settlement contains striking parallels. The poem describes a noble figure pierced by weapons, bleeding openly while all creation mourns. Trees, earth, and sky react to the death. The imagery is not drawn from biblical texts. It comes from an older source. The poem reshapes the crucifixion itself. Christ is presented not as a passive victim, but as a willing warrior. The cross speaks, remembers being cut down, raised up, drenched in blood. Spears strike. Blood flows. Darkness spreads across the land. Creation weeps. These elements do not belong to Christian tradition alone. They echo the story of the bleeding God. The blind figure who strikes the fatal blow appears again under a different name. The old god has been absorbed, transformed, and carried forward under a new identity. This transformation was not deliberate deception. It was continuity. Old symbols remained powerful. They were reused because they still resonated. Behind all of this stands the larger northern worldview. In this vision, the universe itself is born from violence. A giant is killed, and from his body, the world is formed. His blood becomes the sea. His bones become mountains. His skull becomes the sky. Even humanity emerges from driftwood shaped by divine hands. The gods rule for a time, but fate moves steadily toward destruction. Monsters are bound, but not destroyed. A final battle is inevitable. Fire consumes the world. Yet even here, rebirth follows. 2 humans survive. A green earth rises from the sea, and Balder returns. The myth of the dying god was never lost. It changed form, shifted meaning, and adapted to new realities. In peaceful lands, it promised renewal. In violent ages, it accepted loss. But beneath every version lies the same truth. Death is not the final word. What survives of early northern belief is uneven and incomplete. The picture is assembled from fragments, some still vivid, others worn almost to dust. One tradition preserves strong colour and clear form, while the other has lost much of its surface. Where one mosaic remains largely intact, the other survives only in scattered pieces. Yet when these fragments are set side by side, it becomes clear that the older English worldview shared many foundations with the northern tradition, even while differing in important ways. The similarities are more numerous than the differences, and this has often tempted later interpreters to fill the missing English pieces by borrowing directly from the better preserved northern image. That temptation, however, must be resisted. Many elements of the northern record are themselves late and heavily reshaped. They belong to a particular environment and reflect centuries of local development. The traditions preserved in Iceland and Norway are not neutral mirrors of a shared past, but regional expressions shaped by landscape, history, and social change. Even so, the shared vocabulary of the northern peoples points unmistakably to a common inheritance. Words for fate, gods, the world, and its structure appear across related languages in slightly altered forms. These are not borrowings, but parallel survivals from an older tongue once spoken across northwestern Europe. Despite this shared foundation, belief was never fully uniform. The idea that all northern peoples followed a single, identical religion does not withstand close examination. The surviving stories themselves are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Different versions of the same myth coexist, even within a single tradition. What survives is not a single system, but a layered and evolving body of belief. Certain core ideas, however, reach back to deep antiquity. This is especially clear in how the universe was imagined. The world was not seen as an isolated object, but as part of a larger structure. It occupied a middle position, surrounded by other realms. Heaven was above, the land of the dead below. Movement upward led toward light and order, movement downward toward darkness and dissolution. This vertical structure appears consistently across northern languages and traditions. The world itself was understood as an enclosure, a defined space set apart from what lay beyond. It was imagined as a protected middle ground, surrounded by sea and bordered by forces both hostile and necessary. Beyond its limits lay chaos, giants, and powers too great to be contained. This conception did not belong to one people alone, but was shared across the region. The northern tradition describes a complex universe made up of multiple realms. Gods, spirits, humans, giants, and the dead each occupied their own domains. Some traditions speak of 9 such worlds, others of 7. Whether these numbers were symbolic or literal mattered less than the underlying idea. Reality was layered, structured, and alive with unseen forces. There is no strong reason to believe that early English belief lacked a similar complexity. Scattered references suggest that a multi-layered universe was also known there, even if its full structure is no longer recoverable. At the center of this universe stood a great supporting structure, imagined in the northern tradition as a vast tree. Its branches stretched over all realms, its roots reached into the deepest regions, and its trunk bound the universe together. At its base lay springs and wells associated with memory, fate, and renewal. Creatures moved constantly along its length, carrying messages, gnawing at its roots, feeding on its branches. Life and decay were inseparable. This image should not be dismissed as a purely northern invention. While written English sources preserve little direct reference to such a structure, physical evidence suggests that sacred trees and pillars once played a central role in religious life across the region. Wooden columns were revered, poles were raised near shrines, and ritual gatherings took place around them. Even after conversion, echoes of this reverence survived in seasonal customs and communal celebrations. One such pillar was once venerated on the continent, standing near a sacred site and associated with divine power. Its name points to a connection with the world-supporting structure known from the northern tradition. Similar sacred trees are described elsewhere, always located near water, always treated as living presences. Sacrifice, renewal, and judgment were tied to these places. The idea of a world supported by a central structure is not unique to Northern Europe. Similar images appear among peoples separated by vast distances. Pillars holding up the sky, trees linking heaven and earth, and posts marking the center of the world appear again and again. These parallels suggest not borrowing, but a shared human attempt to make sense of existence. Creation itself was imagined as violent and transformative. In the northern story, the world is formed from the body of a primordial being. Flesh becomes land, blood becomes sea, bones become mountains, and the sky is raised overhead. Humanity emerges from natural materials, shaped by divine hands. This theme is not confined to one tradition. Comparable stories appear in continental accounts that predate later northern versions. An ancient continental tradition speaks of a divine figure born from the earth, father of humanity, whose descendants spread across the land. This account aligns closely with northern creation stories and suggests that early English belief also included a myth of origins rooted in sacrifice and transformation. Over time, elements of this myth were reworked, inverted, or partially forgotten, but its core remained recognizable. Some later versions blur these ideas, turning the primordial ancestor into both progenitor and enemy. This confusion points to a long process of reinterpretation rather than a sudden invention. Names themselves preserve traces of older meanings, linking humanity directly to the earth and its first beings. Another account of creation appears to survive beneath the surface of one of the earliest English poems. Long treated as purely Christian, this poem reveals deeper layers when examined closely. Its language preserves images and titles that belong to an older worldview. Heaven is described as a roof, the world as a middle enclosure, and the divine as a measurer who sets boundaries and order. These are not biblical images, but echoes of an earlier cosmology. Key terms in the poem carry meanings that predate Christianity. Titles applied to the creator resemble names once given to fate figures and sky gods. Guardianship, measurement, and ordering are emphasized over creation from nothing. The poem does not invent these ideas, but reshapes them, redirecting them toward a new religious framework. This suggests continuity rather than rupture. Old poetic language was not discarded, but reused. The Christian message was expressed through familiar images because those images still carried power. The older worldview did not vanish, it was absorbed. Belief in an ending was as important as belief in beginnings. Many traditions accept the idea of a final reckoning or transformation. Over time, the word for fate came to mean not simply destiny, but destruction. This shift reflects growing anxiety about the future and the sense that the world was approaching a breaking point. By the end of the first millennium, expectations of an imminent end were widespread. These beliefs were recorded in documents, sermons, and poetry. Yet this sense of doom did not originate locally. It was shaped by ideas that had travelled from the Eastern Mediterranean, where religions of death and rebirth had long promised renewal beyond destruction. These faiths taught that the universe moved in vast cycles. Each cycle ended in catastrophe, followed by renewal. A saviour figure appeared at the turning point, descending into death and returning transformed. Fire and flood destroyed the old world, from which a new one arose. These ideas spread westward and blended with local beliefs. The figure of the Lord, once a fertility god, tied to the seasons, took on a cosmic role. His death and return came to symbolize not just the cycle of crops, but the fate of the universe itself. In the northern world, this transformation took a darker turn. The end became final. Renewal was diminished or forgotten. Destruction overshadowed rebirth. This reflected a society shaped by warfare, hardship, and instability. The English tradition followed a different path. Conversion came earlier, and long periods of relative stability followed. Rather than developing a fully destructive final myth, older ideas were redirected. The old gods were replaced not by annihilation, but by a figure of peace whose story mirrored that of the dying and returning Lord. This helps explain why Christianity was accepted. To ordinary people, it did not arrive as an abstract doctrine. It arrived as a story they already understood. A miraculous birth, a suffering death, a descent into darkness, and a return to life. These elements were familiar. They aligned easily with existing rituals tied to agriculture, seasons, and fertility. The new faith did not erase older practices overnight. Blessings of fields, prayers for rain, seasonal festivals, and rites of mourning and rejoicing continued, now reinterpreted. The old and the new coexisted. Over time, institutional religion grew distant from its roots. Doctrine multiplied, dogma hardened, the immediate connection to nature weakened, the ancient sense of divinity present in the land, sky, and sea faded. What remained was ritual without intimacy. Yet the underlying lesson remains clear. Human well-being depends on balance with the natural world. Ancient belief sought integration, not domination. Life was understood as a cycle, not a conquest. Modern society has largely severed this relationship. Concrete and machinery separate people from earth and sky. Time is ruled by clocks rather than seasons. The result is anxiety, imbalance, and alienation. The old myths do not offer a return to the past, but they do offer insight. They remind that humanity is not separate from nature, but part of it. Survival depends not on control, but on understanding.